The silence after the final applause, or rather the lack thereof, was deafening. It wasn't just the absence of cheers, it was the palpable weight of disappointment that hung in the air, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on every single person in that room. I stood backstage, my heart a hollow drum against my ribs, watching the last model disappear, her shoulders slumped, her walk devoid of the usual runway swagger. My collection, my supposed masterpiece, had just been torn to shreds, not by words yet, but by that far more brutal judge, indifference. The critics in the front row, usually so eager to scribble their initial thoughts, sat stone-faced, their pens still, their expressions ranging from mild boredom to outright disdain. It was a disaster, plain and simple, a spectacular, public, soul-crushing failure. I remember the exact moment the world shifted. It wasn't the reviews that came out later, though those were certainly a fresh stab wound. It was the moment I saw a particular fashion editor, a woman whose opinion I deeply respected, slowly shake her head as she flipped through her notes. Her gaze met mine across the dimly lit backstage area, a look of profound pity etched on her elegant features. That look, more than any scathing headline, pierced me to my core. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even disappointment, it was pity, and that felt like the ultimate dismissal. My vision, my passion, my year of sleepless nights poured into every stitch, had been reduced to an object of pity. The days that followed were a blur of self-doubt and isolation. My phone rang incessantly with calls from my publicist, my investors, my team, all trying to put a brave face on it, but their voices held the same underlying tremor of defeat. I couldn't answer. I just couldn't. I spent my mornings staring at the ceiling, my afternoons wandering through my studio, a ghost in my own creative sanctuary. The mannequins stood like silent accusers, draped in the very garments that had brought about my downfall. The vibrant silks and intricate embroidery, once symbols of my ambition, now felt like mocking effigies of my failed dreams. The air was thick with the scent of regret and stale coffee. Every piece of fabric, every pattern, every sketch seemed to scream its inadequacy at me. I tried to escape it all. I walked for hours through the city, the cold bite of the autumn wind doing little to clear the fog from my mind. The vibrant energy of the streets, usually a source of inspiration, now felt alien, indifferent to my personal catastrophe. I saw women dressed beautifully, their confidence radiating, and I wondered if I had ever truly understood what made people feel that way. Had I been so lost in my own artistic bubble that I had forgotten the very essence of clothing? To adorn, to empower, to express? The thought was a bitter pill. One particularly gray afternoon, I found myself back in the studio, not to work, but to pack things away, to tidy up the wreckage. I started with the mood board from that collection, peeling off images one by one. Delicate watercolors, ethereal landscapes, vintage lace, all the elements that had seemed so poetic at the time now felt flimsy, insubstantial. As I pulled down a particularly intricate piece of embroidery, a small, sharp pain shot through my finger. A loose thread, a rogue needle perhaps, had pricked me. I looked at the tiny bead of blood welling up, a stark crimson against my pale skin. And then, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, not a lightning bolt from the heavens. It was more like a slow, deliberate unfurling, a tightening coil of defiance deep within my gut. Pity. That word echoed again. Pity. How dare they pity me? How dare they dismiss years of relentless effort, of unyielding passion? With a look, a shake of the head, a few condescending lines in a glossy magazine. My failure was public, yes, but it was my nice failure, and if it was mine, then the response, the comeback, the next step, also had to be mine. It couldn't be a quiet retreat, a timid re-entry. It had to be a statement. I looked around the studio again, but this time, my gaze wasn't filled with despair. It was filled with a nascent anger, a simmering resentment that began to morph into something else entirely. Determination. The discarded fabrics, the crumpled sketches, the silent mannequins. They weren't accusing me anymore. They were waiting. They were raw materials waiting to be transformed to tell a new story. A story of resilience. A story of defiance. A story of turning the very instruments of my defeat into the tools of my triumph. The first concept that truly solidified wasn't a garment. It was a feeling. It was the feeling of being exposed, vulnerable, criticized, and then rising from that ashes, stronger, sharper, more defined. I thought about the words that had cut the deepest, the phrases the critics had used: frivolous, uninspired, lackluster, safe. Oh, that word, safe. It was the kiss of death for any designer. They had called it safe, when all I had felt was daring, pushing my own boundaries. But perhaps, in trying to be universally appealing, I had indeed played it too safe, lost my edge. What if I leaned into the criticism? What if I took the very things they found fault with, and twisted them, inverted them, made them the foundation of something new and undeniably powerful? This wasn't about proving them wrong in their terms. It was about proving them irrelevant. It was about creating something so undeniably, so unapologetically bold, that their previous judgments would look utterly foolish in hindsight. This wouldn't be a collection born of a desire to please. It would be born of a desire to provoke, to challenge, to reclaim my narrative. This would be my revenge. My beginning to form, in my mind, a whisper of new ideas, new challenges. The experience had taught me that true artistry was a continuous journey, a perpetual process of creation and reinvention. My brand, once teetering on the brink, was now firmly established, a beacon of strength and innovation. I looked out at the city lights from my window, a new day dawning. The past was a memory, a powerful lesson. The present was vibrant, full of possibility. The future, an open canvas, waiting for my next stroke. I had faced the darkness, embraced the fire, and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably transformed. And I knew with absolute certainty that this was just the beginning of my story, told in thread and cloth, forever echoing my roar. The dawn that broke over the city that day was not merely a new cycle of light, but a vibrant affirmation of a future reshaped. The success of the Phoenix collection had been more than a commercial triumph. It was a profound personal vindication, a declaration of enduring spirit. The roar I had spoken of, once a desperate cry in the wilderness, now echoed with a confident resonance, acknowledged and celebrated. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind, exhilarating and exhausting in equal measure. Orders poured in, overwhelming our small but dedicated team. The phone rang incessantly, a symphony of opportunities, interviews with prominent fashion magazines, invitations to exclusive industry events, inquiries from high-end boutiques across continents. My studio, once a solitary sanctuary, transformed into a bustling hub of activity. We had to scale, and quickly. New pattern makers, skilled seamstresses, a production manager, a marketing assistant. The team expanded, each new face bringing fresh energy and expertise. It was a dizzying dance of delegation and oversight, a crash course in entrepreneurship on a scale I had never anticipated. I found myself wearing multiple hats, not just the designers, but also the CEOs. Meetings replaced sketching sessions, budgets supplanted fabric swatches for a time. The creative flow, once a singular, intense focus, now had to be compartmentalized, snatched in moments between strategic planning and logistical puzzles. There were days when the sheer volume of administrative tasks threatened to drown the artistic soul within me. But then, a quiet moment, a glimpse of a garment from the Phoenix collection being packed for shipment, would remind me of the core reason for all this bustle. Each stitch, each fold, carried a piece of my story, a testament to resilience. The brand, once a fragile seedling, was now a blossoming tree, its roots firmly embedded, its branches reaching for the sky. The financial stability it brought was a profound relief, lifting the crushing weight of uncertainty that had plagued me for so long. No more sleepless nights spent worrying about rent or the next payroll. Instead, the sleepless nights were born of creative fervor, of new ideas bubbling just beneath the surface, demanding to be brought to life. The pressure, however, was immense. The industry, notoriously fickle, celebrated success, with an eager anticipation for the next act. The question on everyone's lips was not if there would be a new collection, but what it would be, and could it possibly surpass the last. The Phoenix had set a high bar, a narrative of rebirth and strength. How could I follow such a powerful statement without merely repeating myself? How could I evolve without losing the essence of what made the brand unique? This was the new challenge, more subtle than the previous battle for survival, but no less formidable. It was the challenge of sustained innovation, of proving that the first success was not a fluke, but the harbinger of a lasting artistic legacy. I needed to retreat, to find the quiet space where inspiration truly bloomed. The city, for all its vibrant energy, had become too loud, too demanding. I sought refuge in a small, remote cabin nestled by a wild coastline, far from the clamor of fashion weeks and media calls. Here the only sounds were the rhythmic roar of the ocean, the whisper of wind through ancient trees, and the cry of gulls. I walked for hours along deserted beaches, collecting fragments of driftwood, smooth sea glass, pebbles worn round by the relentless tide. I watched the waves crash and recede, an endless cycle of power and surrender. It was in this solitude, this communion with raw nature, that the seed of the next collection began to take root. The Phoenix had been about fire, about dramatic transformation. What came after the fire? The ash, yes, but also the enduring elements: water, earth, air. The ocean's vastness, its depth, its ceaseless motion, began to speak to me. The way light played on its surface, the shifting hues from deep indigo to shimmering silver, the intricate patterns left by receding foam on wet sand. There was a profound strength in its fluidity, a quiet power in its ceaseless ebb and flow. I began to sketch, not with the frenetic energy of past collections, but with a meditative calm. The lines were softer, more organic, mirroring the natural world. I envisioned fabrics that moved like water, draped with an effortless grace, textiles that held the subtle sheen of a wet pebble or the muted tones of a storm-swept sky. The concept began to crystallize, a collection exploring the idea of fluidity, of quiet strength, of the beauty found in natural forms and the ephemeral moments of existence. It would be a counterpoint to the dramatic assertion of the Phoenix, a whispered conversation rather than a shouted declaration. I called it ebb and flow. The challenge was immense: how to translate the intangible qualities of water and light into structured garments. How to create pieces that felt both ethereal and grounded, delicate yet strong. I experimented with new dyeing techniques, seeking to capture the nuanced gradients of the ocean. I sourced fabrics with exceptional drape and texture. Silk chiffons that floated like seafoam, finely woven. Linens that felt like sun-warmed sand. Specialized knits that mimicked the subtle undulations of a calm surface, or the texture of sand left striated by retreating tides. I wanted to evoke not just the appearance of water, but its very essence, its movement, its reflective qualities, its constant state of transformation. This was not a collection about literal interpretations, no obvious shell motifs or fish scales, but rather an exploration of the feeling of being near water, of its quiet power and serene beauty. The initial sketches were a whirlwind of soft lines and organic shapes. I found myself drawing endlessly, letting the pencil flow across the paper almost without conscious direction, as if guided by an unseen current. Layers became crucial, allowing garments to drift and shift with the wearer's movement, creating an illusion of depth and transparency. Asymmetrical hemlines, cowl necks that rippled like disturbed water, sleeves that billowed gently like sails in a light breeze. These were the nascent forms. Translating these ethereal concepts into tangible patterns was a painstaking process. Artistic revenge. I started sketching, not with the delicate lines I was known for, but with furious, almost violent strokes. I used charcoal, black and unforgiving, letting the raw energy flow onto the page. I wasn't drawing dresses anymore. I was drawing armor. I was drawing shields. I was drawing statements. The lines were sharp, angular, almost architectural. I wanted to create silhouettes that commanded attention, that demanded respect, that couldn't possibly be ignored or dismissed as safe. My studio transformed from a place of mourning into a laboratory of reinvention. I pulled out fabrics I had always considered too unconventional, too challenging, too difficult to work with. Heavy industrial felts, stiffened canvases, metallic mesh that gleamed like chainmail. I even found a roll of discarded theatrical scrim, the kind used to create transparent effects on stage, and something about its delicate yet surprisingly resilient structure sparked an idea. Transparency, but with strength. Vulnerability, but with an underlying steel. The initial designs were rough, almost brutalist. I wasn't thinking about wearability in the traditional sense yet. I was thinking about impact, about statement. I wanted the clothing to feel like a second skin, but one that protected, that announced its presence. I started experimenting with deconstruction, taking apart old garments, dissecting their forms, and then reassembling them in unexpected ways. A sleeve might become a collar, a hemline might become a structural element. It was messy, chaotic work, but there was a thrilling sense of liberation in it. I was breaking all my own rules, shedding the constraints of what I thought I should be creating. The hours blurred again, but this time, it was a different kind of blur. It was the focused intensity of creation, the exhilarating dance between idea and execution. I often worked through the night, the only sound the hum of my sewing machine, and the occasional rustle of fabric. The city outside slept, but my studio was alive with a fierce, quiet energy. I felt like a sculptor, chipping away at a block of marble, slowly revealing the form hidden within. Each stitch, each cut, each drape was deliberate, imbued with a newfound purpose. I began to think about texture and how it could convey emotion. The rough, unfinished edges of some fabrics, the unexpected sheen of others. I wanted contrasts. Softness against hardness, fluidity against rigidity, light against shadow. It was a dialogue, a conversation playing out in fabric. I remembered the fashion editor's pitying gaze, and I decided that this collection would strip away any pretense of vulnerability. It would be an assertion of power, an unapologetic declaration of artistic autonomy. One evening, staring at a particularly challenging drape of heavy canvas, I realized I needed a symbol, a recurring motif that would tie the collection together, something that spoke to resilience, to overcoming. My eyes fell on a small, rusted piece of metal I had picked up on one of my aimless walks, a fragment of something broken, yet still holding its shape. It was imperfect, scarred, but undeniably strong. And it clicked. The idea wasn't about perfection. It was about the beauty found in imperfection, the strength forged in adversity. I started incorporating metallic elements, not shiny or new, but distressed, oxidized, bearing the marks of time and experience. These weren't mere embellishments. They were narrative elements telling a story of survival and transformation. I experimented with layering, building up complex structures that gave the illusion of weight and protection, while still allowing for movement and fluidity. There was a deliberate tension in each piece, a push and pull between the desire to shield oneself and the innate human need for expression. I thought about the feeling of being judged, of having layers stripped away, and I decided to create garments that would rebuild those layers, but this time, on my own terms. Each layer was a statement, a defiance, a new skin. The color palette emerged organically. It was stark, initially. Deep, bruised purples, charcoal grays, obsidian blacks, punctuated by flashes of molten gold, and a startling, almost aggressive crimson. These weren't colors of gentle beauty. They were colors of strength, of passion, of a phoenix rising from the ashes. I wanted the collection to feel visceral, to evoke a powerful emotional response. I wanted it to be unsettling, perhaps, but undeniably compelling. I knew this collection would be a departure from anything I had done before. My previous work had been celebrated for its delicate femininity, its romanticism. This was something entirely different. It was raw, powerful, almost architectural. It was a confrontation, a challenge. And I realized, with a thrill that ran through me, that this was exactly what it needed to be. This wasn't just about fashion anymore. It was about identity, about reclaiming my voice. The first few prototypes were difficult. The materials were unforgiving, the seams complex, the structures challenging. There were moments of frustration, moments where I doubted if I could truly pull it off. I would stare at a half-finished garment, feeling the familiar dread creep in, the whispers of failure trying to reassert themselves. But then, I would remember that look of pity, those dismissive words, and a fresh wave of resolve would wash over me. No, not this time. This time I would push through. I worked closely with my pattern maker, a quiet, meticulous woman named Alara, who had been with me since the very beginning. She was a master of her craft, able to translate my wildest visions into precise, workable patterns. At first, she was hesitant, accustomed to my more conventional designs, but as I explained the concept, the story behind each piece, her eyes lit up with a quiet understanding. She saw the rebellion, the anger, the fierce artistic spirit that fueled this new direction. And she became my indispensable ally, her technical genius bringing my abstract ideas to life. We spent countless hours draped over cutting tables, arguing over seam lines, experimenting with new construction techniques. Her calm precision balanced my sometimes frenzied creativity, a perfect synergy. One evening, as we were struggling with a particularly complex shoulder structure, trying to make it both rigid and comfortable, Alara paused, looking at the garment with her head tilted. She then said, in her soft voice, "This isn't just clothing, is it? This is armor for the soul." Her words resonated deeply. Yes, exactly. It was armor, but an armor that didn't hide. It revealed. It revealed strength, resilience, and an unwavering spirit. The studio slowly filled with these new creations. Each piece was a statement, a dialogue between fragility and power. There were flowing gowns crafted from unexpected materials, their delicate movement contrasting sharply with their robust construction. There were tailored jackets that seemed to defy gravity, their sharp angles and exaggerated shoulders creating a formidable silhouette. And there were intricate textile manipulations, where layers of fabric were slashed, burned, and reassembled, creating textures that were both beautiful and unsettling, like scars that told a story of healing. I started to see the collection as a narrative arc, a journey from vulnerability to unshakable strength. The opening looks would be more introspective, perhaps a little raw, hinting at the struggle. Then, as the collection progressed, the pieces would become bolder, more assertive, culminating in looks that were undeniably powerful, almost defiant. It wasn't just a series of garments. It was a performance, a visual symphony of resilience. The financial strain was immense. The failure of the last collection had hit hard, and securing new funding for something so radically different was a challenge. My investors were wary, their faith shaken. I had to pitch this new vision, with every fiber of my being, not just as a collection, but as a redemption, a necessary artistic evolution. I spoke with passion, with conviction, describing not just the aesthetic but the emotional core of what I was trying to achieve. I showed them the sketches, the fabric samples, the early prototypes, letting the pieces speak for themselves. It was a gamble, a huge risk, but I knew, with an almost spiritual certainty, that this was the path I had to take. Miraculously, or perhaps because my passion was so infectious, a few key investors, those who had always believed in my artistic integrity, decided to take another chance. Their trust, their willingness to support my radical new direction, fueled me even further. It wasn't just about my own redemption anymore. It was about honoring their belief in me, proving that their faith was not misplaced. The pressure mounted as the show date approached. Every detail became critical. The lighting, the music, the casting of the models, even the set design. I wanted the entire experience to be immersive, to transport the audience into the world I had created. The runway itself wouldn't be a simple straight line. I envisioned something more dramatic, with unexpected turns and levels, reflecting the journey of the collection itself. The music wouldn't be generic, runway beats. It would be a custom-composed score, atmospheric and powerful, building in intensity with each passing look. I spent hours selecting the models, not just for their beauty, but for their strength of character, their ability to embody the spirit of the collection. I wanted women who exuded confidence, who could carry the weight and power of these garments with grace and conviction. We rehearsed tirelessly, focusing not just on their walk, but on their presence, their attitude. This wasn't about simply showcasing clothes. It was about telling a story through movement and expression. There were moments of sheer exhaustion, moments when I felt the weight of expectation threaten to crush me. The late nights, the endless fittings, the constant problem-solving. But even in those moments, a deep, quiet joy sustained me. I was creating something truly authentic, something that felt like a direct extension of my soul. This collection was born from pain, yes, but it was being forged with an undeniable passion and a fierce determination. It was my truth, expressed in fabric and form. As the final week before the show dawned, the studio was a hive of controlled chaos. Seamstresses worked around the clock, embroiderers added the last intricate details, stylists meticulously planned each look. I moved through it all, a whirlwind of adrenaline and focus, making last-minute adjustments, checking every stitch, every drape, every accessory. There was a nervous energy in the air, a mix of anticipation and anxiety, but beneath it all, a palpable sense of excitement. We were on the cusp of something truly special. I remember standing in the middle of the finished collection, arrayed on mannequins, waiting for their moment in the spotlight. The lights of the studio were dim, casting long shadows that made the garments seem to pulse with a life of their own. The deep colors, the sharp silhouettes, the metallic accents, they all came together in a powerful symphony. It wasn't just clothing, it was a statement, a declaration, a challenge, and I knew, with every fiber of my being, that this was the collection I was meant to create. It was my response, my roar, my triumph. The pity, the criticism, the failure, they had all been necessary ingredients, the crucible in which this new vision had been forged. The night before the show, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced, replaying every detail, every decision. I walked through the empty show venue, imagining the audience, the music, the models. The air was thick with expectation. I touched the fabric of one of the opening looks, a heavily textured coat with a dramatic, almost sculptural collar. It felt solid, substantial, a physical manifestation of my resolve. This wasn't just a collection. It was a conversation with the world, a response to all those who had doubted, who had dismissed. It was my story, told in thread and cloth. The morning of the show arrived with a strange, almost ethereal quietness. I woke before the alarm, the pre-dawn light barely filtering through the thick curtains. There was no racing heart, no panicky breath. Instead, a profound stillness settled over me, a calm born of absolute certainty. Every decision had been made, every stitch accounted for, every detail meticulously placed. All that remained was to present it. I dressed simply, in dark, comfortable clothes, and made my way to the venue. The city was just beginning to stir, a low hum rising from the streets. Inside, the cavernous space was already a hive of controlled activity. Lights were being tested, music levels adjusted, the last touches applied to the runway itself. The air thrummed with a nervous energy, but it was an excited hum, not a frantic one. My team, a small army of dedicated individuals, moved with practiced efficiency. Their faces, though tired, held a shared sense of purpose, a quiet pride in the masterpiece we were about to unveil. Backstage was a different world entirely. A symphony of organized chaos. Hairstylists sculpted gravity-defying forms. Makeup artists painted faces with precision, transforming models into living extensions of my vision. The scent of hairspray mingled with the faint aroma of coffee and the clean, sharp smell of new fabric. Garment racks, heavy with the collection, lined the walls, each piece a silent testament to months of relentless work. I moved through the crowded space, a silent observer, my presence a steady anchor. I watched as each model slipped into their designated look, the fabric falling exactly as intended, the silhouettes taking on their powerful architectural forms. A final tug on a sleeve, a last-minute adjustment to a collar, a reassuring glance exchanged with a model. Each interaction was brief, wordless, yet imbued with a shared understanding. There was a moment, just before the first guests began to arrive, when I stood alone for a breath, gazing at the lineup. The models, now fully transformed, stood like statues, poised and ready. The clothes were no longer mere garments. They were armor. They were art. They were the very language I had sought to speak. A wave of emotion, hot and intense, washed over me. It was not doubt, but a profound sense of vindication, a recognition of the journey. The crucible had indeed forged something unbreakable. The rising murmur from the front of house, the distant chatter and clinking of glasses, signaled the imminent arrival of the audience. The air thickened with expectation. Then, the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd, a collective intake of breath. The music began, a deep, resonant bass line that vibrated through the floor, slowly building into a powerful, almost primal rhythm. It was a soundscape designed to command attention, to prepare the senses for what was to come. My heart hammered, not with fear, but with a fierce, exhilarating anticipation. This was it. The first model stepped onto the runway, emerging from the darkness into the stark, theatrical light. She wore the heavily textured coat I had touched the night before, its sculptural collar framing her face like a defiant halo. The fabric, rich and robust, seemed to absorb the light, giving her an almost monolithic presence. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Photographers, flashes erupted, a staccato burst of light. I watched from the wings, a shadow amidst the shadows, my gaze fixed on every movement, every nuance. Each piece that followed was a carefully considered chapter in the story. The sharp tailoring, the unexpected cutouts revealing glimpses of skin, the interplay of matte and metallic, the deliberate asymmetry. There were moments of stark minimalism contrasted with bursts of intricate embellishment, all unified by the powerful, unyielding silhouette. The collection spoke of strength, resilience, and a fierce, unyielding spirit. It was a dialogue between vulnerability and power, expressed through fabric and form. The models moved with a deliberate, confident stride, their expressions unreadable, yet conveying an inner resolve. They were not just showcasing clothes, they were embodying the very essence of the collection. I saw the heads in the audience turn, eyes wide with surprise, then recognition, then admiration. I saw critics, usually impassive, lean forward, their pens poised, their faces alight with interest. Buyers, their expressions typically guarded, nodded slowly, a glint of excitement in their eyes. The energy in the room was palpable, a current of electricity that flowed from the runway to every corner of the vast space. There was a particular piece, a flowing gown crafted from a shimmering, almost liquid metal fabric that seemed to glide effortlessly, catching and refracting the light with every step. It was a breathtaking moment, a pure expression of the collection's duality, formidable yet fluid, strong yet undeniably beautiful. The applause, which had been sporadic but growing, swelled into a sustained roar. As the final model completed her walk, the entire collection re-emerged for the finale, a powerful procession of my vision made manifest. The combined impact was overwhelming. The music reached its crescendo, a powerful emotional swell that filled the space. The applause was deafening now, a thunderous ovation that rose from every seat. Then, it was my turn. I stepped out from the wings, blinking slightly in the blinding light, walking the length of the runway. My breath caught in my throat, but my stride was firm, my head held high. I met the gazes of the audience, scanning the sea of faces, recognizing some, seeing awe in others. There was no shyness, no humility, only a profound sense of accomplishment and a quiet, burning satisfaction. This was my response. This was my roar. This was my triumph. The standing ovation was a physical manifestation of their acceptance, their understanding, their surrender to the power of what they had just witnessed. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated vindication. I bowed, a deep, heartfelt gesture, a silent thank you to the universe, to my team, to myself. The journey had been arduous, but the destination, this moment, was worth every single step. Backstage, the moment I stepped off the runway, I was enveloped in a whirlwind of hugs, cheers, and joyous tears. My team surrounded me, their faces beaming, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the euphoria of shared success. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated elation. The air buzzed with adrenaline and relief. Bottles of champagne appeared as if by magic, corks popping like celebratory gunfire. But there was little time for lingering. The immediate aftermath was a torrent of eager faces. Journalists, their notebooks open, clamored for interviews. Buyers, their eyes gleaming with commercial intent, pressed business cards into my hand. Industry figures, those who had once looked away, now approached with effusive praise, their words tumbling over each other in their haste to congratulate. I gave brief, concise answers, my voice steady, despite the tremor of emotion running through me. I spoke of the journey, the inspiration, the power of perseverance. I spoke of finding strength in vulnerability, of turning adversity into art. Every word felt imbued with a new weight, a new authority. Later, I managed to steal a quiet moment in a secluded corner, the backstage clamor a muffled hum beyond the door. I leaned against a cool wall, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a profound sense of exhaustion. But it was a good exhaustion, a satisfying ache that spoke of effort well spent. I closed my eyes, letting the images of the show replay in my mind, the powerful stride of the models, the shimmering fabric, the collective gasp of the audience, the thunderous applause. It had all been real. It had all happened. The after-party was a blur of flashing lights, clinking glasses, and a constant stream of compliments. It felt like walking through a dream, a surreal landscape, where everyone knew my name, everyone wanted a piece of my time, everyone offered congratulations. Faces I barely recognized, people who had once dismissed me, now approached with an almost desperate eagerness to connect. I smiled, I thanked, I nodded, navigating the crowd with a newfound confidence. The champagne flowed freely, and the music pulsed through the night. It was a celebration, not just of a collection, but of a comeback, a resurrection. The first reviews began trickling in before dawn. I read them on my phone. Huddled in my apartment, the city still asleep. They were overwhelmingly positive, effusive, using words like groundbreaking, revelatory, a powerful return, a masterclass in resilience. The critics, those formidable gatekeepers of taste, lauded the collection's strength, its narrative depth, its undeniable impact. They spoke of a designer who had not just survived, but had transformed, emerging stronger and more visionary than ever before. One particularly influential critic, known for her sharp tongue, wrote a piece titled "The Phoenix Rises," detailing my journey from public failure to triumphant comeback, praising the collection as a bold, uncompromising statement. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented. My phone rang incessantly. Interview requests flooded in from every major fashion publication, from television shows, from online platforms. Profiles were written, features were published, my face appeared in magazines and on websites. I spoke of the dark times, of the lessons learned, of the artistic imperative to create, regardless of the odds. But I spoke not with bitterness, but with a quiet strength, a wisdom earned through adversity. The narrative shifted dramatically. I was no longer the fallen star, the cautionary tale. I was the phoenix, the symbol of reinvention, the embodiment of artistic integrity. The commercial success followed swiftly. Buyers, convinced by the critical acclaim and the overwhelming public buzz, placed large orders. The collection, once a risky gamble, became a commercial juggernaut. Pre-orders soared. Pieces sold out almost immediately. The investment, the sacrifice, the months of relentless work, all began to pay off in tangible ways. My studio, once a place of quiet desperation, now hummed with a new energy, a vibrant optimism. New opportunities arose, collaborations were proposed. The future suddenly stretched out, bright and full of promise. Encounters with former detractors were inevitable. Some offered awkward, mumbled apologies, their eyes avoiding mine. Others simply offered effusive praise, pretending their past dismissals had never happened. I met them all with a calm, gracious demeanor. There was no need for grand gestures of revenge, no need for cutting remarks. The success of the collection, its undeniable power, was its own eloquent response, its own perfect vindication. The need to prove them wrong had fueled me, certainly, but now, having achieved it, that need had dissipated, replaced by a deeper, more profound sense of self-acceptance. The weight I had carried for so long, the burden of failure and public scrutiny, slowly began to lift. It was not an instantaneous relief, but a gradual shedding, like layers of old skin. I found a new sense of peace, a quiet contentment that settled deep within me. My voice, once hesitant, now resonated with conviction. I had not just created a collection. I had rediscovered myself. This journey, I realized, had been about more than just fashion. It was about the relentless pursuit of an artistic vision, about the courage to stand by one's convictions, even when the world doubts. Failure had been the most potent teacher, the crucible that had stripped away the inessential, revealing the core of who I was meant to be. The criticism, the pity, the ridicule, they had been the fuel, the fire that forged this new, stronger self. Success, I discovered, was not merely happiness or wealth, though those were welcome byproducts. It was a profound sense of purpose, a deep satisfaction that came from having created something truly meaningful, something that resonated with others, something that told a story. It was the joy of seeing my vision understood, appreciated, celebrated. But this was not the end. It was a new beginning. The momentum gained had to be maintained, the artistic voice constantly honed, the vision continually evolved. I had no intention of resting on these laurels. The next collection was already